A bridge can look like an ordinary piece of equipment until an army's fate depends on it. In the dark confusion around Dever the Israeli countercrossing had begun, with rubber boats and paratroopers. But boats could only make a foothold. They could not carry the weight of a mechanized campaign. To turn the West Bank lodgment from a daring intrusion into a real operational threat, Israel needed bridges across the Suez Canal, and those bridges had to reach the water through roads still under fire, past wrecked vehicles, tired crews, and Egyptian positions that refused to disappear. This is the part of the battle where logistics becomes drama, because a late bridge could be as dangerous as an enemy tank, and a stalled convoy could decide whether men on the far bank lived or died. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The crossing plan had always depended on sequence. First, Israeli forces had to find the seam near Dever. Then they had to push through the corridor east of the canal, clear enough of the Chinese farm area, and put infantry across in small boats. After that came the harder transformation, turning a small lodgment into a crossing site that could feed tanks, artillery, fuel, ammunition, ambulances, engineers, and command vehicles onto the West Bank. A bridge is not just a path over water. It is the point where tactical success becomes operational movement. Without it, Dani Matt's paratroopers could hold a patch of Egyptian soil, but they could not become the vanguard of a force large enough to threaten Egypt's rear. The Israelis had crossing equipment, but having equipment is not the same as delivering it. Some of it was heavy, awkward, and slow-moving, especially the large roller bridge that had been designed to span the canal but was difficult to haul through the desert under wartime conditions. There were also rafts, ferries, and other bridging means, each with its own crews, vehicles, procedures, and vulnerabilities. These systems needed roads, space, time, and protection. The battlefield gave them very little of any of those things. The tracks leading toward Dever were crowded with tanks, half-tracks, infantry carriers, ammunition vehicles, wounded men, and units trying to go forward while others tried to come back. In daylight, that would have been hard enough. At night and under threat, it became a contest against chaos. The routes named Lexicon, Terter, and Akavish now mattered because the bridges had to pass through them or near them to reach the canal. A tank column might sometimes maneuver around a problem, but a bridge convoy could not simply scatter across the desert and reassemble wherever it pleased. The equipment was too large, too slow, and too dependent on a usable route. A single blocked section could stop everything behind it. A wrecked vehicle in the wrong place could delay an entire crossing system. Egyptian fire did not have to destroy every piece of bridging equipment to endanger the operation. It only had to slow movement, add confusion, and keep the corridor uncertain long enough for the first Israeli foothold west of the canal to remain dangerously thin. The men moving the bridges fought a kind of battle that rarely receives the attention given to tank duels. Their enemy was not only Egyptian artillery or anti-tank fire, though both mattered. It was also dust, darkness, mechanical strain, poor visibility, traffic control, and the pressure of knowing that everyone was waiting for them. Drivers had to keep heavy vehicles moving over rough ground. Engineers had to prepare equipment while the tactical situation shifted around them. Commanders had to decide which route was truly open and which was only open in a report that had already become obsolete. Every delay had consequences beyond the convoy itself. On the West Bank, Israeli troops needed reinforcement. On the East Bank, the corridor had to be held. At the canal, the crossing site waited like a question. The roller bridge became one of the great symbols of this struggle because it represented both ingenuity and frustration. It was a bold solution in concept, a way to bring heavy armor across the canal and make the crossing decisive. But bold equipment still has to obey physics, roads, maintenance, and time. Moving it forward was slow and difficult, and the fight around the approach routes made the delay more dangerous. The bridge's story reminds us that military innovation is never valuable in the abstract. A clever device that cannot arrive when needed may be less useful than a simpler system already in place. In the middle of the battle, no one needed a symbol. They needed a crossing that worked. Meanwhile, The first Israelis on the West Bank could not wait comfortably. Their presence behind Egyptian lines was a major achievement, but it was also a risk. A lodgment across water is like a hand gripping a ledge. It must pull the body after it or eventually lose strength. The paratroopers could expand, patrol, and disrupt, but they needed tanks and heavier weapons if the operation was to survive Egyptian reaction. They also needed supplies, evacuation routes, and confidence that they were not being left as a raiding force cut off by the canal behind them. That emotional burden matters. A soldier across a river or canal knows exactly how narrow his lifeline is. He listens not only for enemy fire ahead, but for the sound of his own army arriving behind him. Egyptian commanders were beginning to understand that the Israeli move at Dever was more than a local disturbance. The danger was no longer only east of the canal, where Egyptian bridgeheads faced Israeli forces in Sinai. Israeli troops were now west of the canal, threatening the rear of the Egyptian armies and the air defense network that had been so important since the opening day. This meant the bridges became targets, not just in the physical sense, but in the operational sense. If Egypt could prevent heavy Israeli forces from crossing, the West Bank foothold might remain contained. If the bridges opened and tanks crossed in strength, then the entire balance of the canal front would change. Every hour of delay gave Egypt more time to react. Every Israeli vehicle that crossed reduced that time. The fighting around the bridges also showed how closely engineering and combat are tied together. Engineers are sometimes imagined as men who arrive after the battle to repair what soldiers have broken. At Dever, they were inside the battle itself. They had to work while the front was still fluid, while routes were still being fought over, and while commanders demanded speed that the ground did not always permit. Their work required calculation, muscle, technical skill, and nerve. A bridge under fire is not a calm construction project. It is a wager made in metal and water, while artillery can interrupt any movement, while vehicles can jam the approaches, and while one mistake in positioning can multiply into hours of delay. For the tank crews waiting to cross, the bridge represented release. On the East Bank, Israeli armor had fought to hold open the corridor and protect the crossing site, but its real operational power would be felt once tanks could move west in numbers. A tank on the wrong side of the water might defend a route. A tank on the West Bank could threaten missile batteries, artillery positions, depots, headquarters, and the roads feeding Egyptian forces in Sinai. This is why the arrival of crossing equipment mattered so deeply. The canal had separated possibility from power. The bridge would join them. Once heavy vehicles began to cross, the Israeli operation would no longer be a fragile surprise. It would become a new front in Egypt's rear. The delay and confusion should not be read as evidence that the operation was poorly imagined from start to finish. All canal crossings are difficult, and this one was attempted under extreme pressure after days of crisis against an enemy still fighting hard. The Israeli army was trying to do something tremendously complicated while exhausted and under fire. That does not excuse every mistake or erase the cost of poor coordination, but it does help explain why the bridge story is so messy. War often punishes the very operations most likely to matter. The more decisive the maneuver, the more demands it places on timing, traffic, equipment, and command. At Dever, the bridge convoys carried not only metal spans, but the accumulated strain of the entire counteroffensive. The human cost of this logistical fight was real, even when it lacked the obvious drama of infantry assaults at Chinese Farm. Men were wounded or killed while moving equipment, guarding routes, directing traffic, repairing vehicles, and trying to keep the crossing alive. Others endured exhaustion so deep that judgment itself became harder. The battlefield around them did not pause because the task was technical. Shells did not distinguish between a tank crew and a bridging crew. A stalled vehicle under fire could become a target, an obstacle, and a source of panic all at once. It is worth saying plainly that logistics in war is not a safe rear area activity when the front is moving through the supply line. At Dever, the supply line was the front. When the bridges finally began to function, the meaning of the campaign shifted. Israeli armor and heavier forces could cross in growing numbers, and the West Bank lodgment could expand from a dangerous foothold into a serious threat. Egypt's canal victory was not erased, but it was now endangered from behind. The missile umbrella that had shielded Egyptian troops could be attacked at its edges and rear. Roads supporting the Egyptian Third Army could be threatened. The canal, which Egypt had turned into a doorway on the 6th of October, now served Israel in the opposite direction. That reversal did not come from tanks alone. It came from boats, roads, engineers, bridges, and men forcing equipment through a corridor that had nearly consumed the whole plan. Bridges Under Fire belongs in this story because it strips armored warfare down to one of its most essential truths. Movement is built before it is exploited. Tanks can shock, maneuver, and destroy, but only if someone gets them across the obstacle. The Israeli countercrossing became famous because armored forces eventually drove west of the canal and changed the operational map. Yet that movement depended on less glamorous struggles against delay, congestion, broken machinery, and enemy fire. At Deversoir, the bridge was not scenery. It was the hinge between survival and initiative, between a raid and a counteroffensive, between men stranded across dark water and an army entering Egypt proper. The battle for the bridges proved that in modern mechanized war, steel does not merely fight. It must first arrive.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.